Joined now by TSN Hockey Insider, Wednesday regular, one half of the Dregs Hockey Podcast, Mr. Darren Dreger from the General Managers Meetings.
Like we planned it almost, right?
In Florida.
There's the trade deadline's long past. What are we going to talk to Dregs about? Well, they were so kind to put GM's meetings for us.
Right.
So close after the deadline.
So, how's your tan working?
Yeah, I wish it was working better because that's the big misconception, right? And you guys have been in media a long, long time. Everybody just assumes post-trade deadline, we go to Florida, we spend the majority of our time on a beach or poolside, and not a lot of work gets done. And I wish that were the truth. What is the truth is we spend 85% of our time trolling lobbies, right? Like looking for a stray general manager who's gone to go to the bathroom. Maybe you can grab him for 2 minutes and get some breaking news. But no, you know what's become of these March general managers meetings is more of cleanup work than actual heavy lifting work. And we've seen enough heavy lifting work with rule recommendations and rule changes and, you know, the adaptation to video review and all of that over the years. So the messaging here, even though they talked about some interesting stuff, which I know we're going to dive into, the messaging here was that the game is in good shape. And so when they're looking at some of these interpretations, whatever, it's more about the idea of maybe improving in the future, but nobody's locked into any one thing yet.
You know, 30 years in the business, you have the respect of your peers and the public. You know, you're well known across the country. And there you are, the indignity of trying to catch a guy as he's coming out of the men's room for 2 minutes of conversation before he has to.
I can't count the number of times I've done that, and maybe less so since they moved the trade deadline, right? Because you know, back in the day, the GM's meetings would be before the trade deadline, and not long before, like a week or two, and it was just mayhem, right? Because you'd look and you'd see two general managers talking in the hallway and your spidey senses are tingling. Well, they must be working on a trade. So I used to do it more than I do now.
Let's start with things that are connected to the Canucks from those meetings, and that means we can put the playoff format far away from here. The salary cap, $1 million. They're saying still, and usually this is officially unfurled in June. Yeah, but we're pretty close to June. I mean, I can't see this equation changing. Can you?
I can see it changing, but for the first time, Commissioner Bettman actually was willing to acknowledge that it's in the court now of the Players Association. You know, does the Players Association want to, you know, wrestle with the escrow percentage, and by doing that, beef up the escrow percentage, which isn't a good thing for the player, but it could elevate the salary cap for next season as much as $3 million. That's going to have to be a negotiation between the National Hockey League and the Players Association. So go back to the time where the players had to pay back the $1.5 billion, right? So Bettman also talked today about that payback. It could be complete this year if they don't mess around with the salary cap. And if the cap is flat, then there's a strong chance that payback is complete this year. Worst case, next year, which is well in advance of what was predicted, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So that's going to be up to the Players Association. And Bettman acknowledged that. At the Board of Governors meetings in December, he didn't want to talk about it. He just said, look, the cap is going to be flat. Let's not get into a public negotiation with the Players Association. There's no reason to. He was more willing to consider that. And keep this in mind. Once that $1.5 billion is paid back, the salary cap could escalate up to $4.5 million or higher. So, it'll be up to the Players Association to decide what next year looks like, and how they negotiate that with the league. We'll have to wait and see, but we're not that far away from the salary cap increasing dramatically.
Interesting. A couple of other interesting topics came up. The scratching of healthy players in advance of the trade deadline. And Darren, we saw it here with Luke Schenn, who missed a number of games as the Canucks were trying to peddle him.
Three primary players that were involved here, right? Obviously, Jake Chychrun, then with the Arizona Coyotes, Vladdy Gavrikov with the Columbus Blue Jackets, and Luke Schenn then with the Vancouver Canucks. I asked Commissioner Bettman, in fact, it was the first thing I asked, just whether or not this is something that they're concerned with. Is it a trend? How do we describe what we experienced and what these teams did? And he said it's too soon to say that it's a trend, but it's definitely something that they're monitoring. And the phrase was interesting, right? I mean, as you get closer to the playoffs, we're going to talk more and more about load management with teams that are locked in and now they're resting players. Prior to the trade deadline, it was players healthy scratch for trade-related reasons. And clubs were bold. They just flat out admitted it. Here's what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it. So I think the league was a bit surprised at the boldness of the clubs. But they're not prepared at this stage to say that they're concerned with it, that it's a problem, but it is something that they are going to monitor to see if it develops into a trend. And if it develops into a trend, then maybe you consider what options you may have to encourage clubs not to do that. But they noted that, like the rest of us, they were a bit surprised at how early teams healthy scratch these players, because normally it's when a trade is imminent, right, that you sit those players. And that was not the case for Luke Schenn or Gavrikov or Jake Chychrun.
The Canucks are a good shootout team, so they might be dismayed by this normally, except they're also a very good overtime team.
Interesting.
So if they increased overtime, they probably wouldn't be too sad about that, because they've got a good selection. You only need a handful of good overtime players. Could overtime go to 7 minutes?
It could. Again, no recommendation coming out of this meeting, just a healthy appetite for further discussion. And you guys are aware of the process, right? It's not like the GMs make a determination and wave the magic wand, get the lawyers involved, and it's done. You advance moving forward, and here we go next season. The takeaway from this is, and there was a good amount of discussion on this. It was interesting because one general manager threw this at me at the conclusion of the meetings today, and he said, yeah, there was a bit of discussion on this. It's interesting, expanding the overtime from a 5-minute period to a 7-minute period. And guys, remember, the East Coast Hockey League experimented with this, and the results were positive. Like, games were determined with that extra 2 minutes. And it's about trying to minimize the shootout a little more. It's about making sure that the entertainment value is as good as it can be. And really, we're talking about normally the top players in each club that are going to be impacted, because those are the players that play in that 5-minute overtime period. But the process does include the Players Association. So the takeaway from this week in Florida is, okay, well, let's have ongoing dialogue on that internally as a league, but let's bring the Players Association in at the competition committee and then decide, what's their appetite for it? Because 2 minutes may not seem like a lot, but 2 minutes for Connor McDavid is a lot, considering how much he plays in regulation. The flip side, as another general manager indicated, was, well, you don't think that they're going to be in favor because it's going to pad their stats, right? I mean, 2 extra minutes for Connor McDavid or Leon Draisaitl or Elias Pettersson, go down the list to get that goal or get that assist matters in the big picture. 100%.
And here's why I applaud them for looking at this, particularly in an age where we're talking about shorter attention spans and everybody trying to condense the time of their games, Major League Baseball most notably. You almost never get whistles in overtime anymore.
No. Yeah.
Possession is everything. So 2 minutes for the TV networks could legitimately mean just 2 minutes.
Yeah. But that would be my concern here, guys, is that when you go to 7 minutes, less urgency because you've got more time. You see more of these resets, Yeah.
Or coaches, they coach not to lose, right? Not always to win.
Mm-hmm.
Although in overtime you've secured the point. You're right. And coaches normally think defense first, right? So are we going to see overtime start with 2 defensemen on the ice rather than, 2 forwards and a defenseman, or 3 forwards? Let's try and win this thing. So it's going to be interesting to see how coaches kind of work through this process.
Darren, our listeners were quite caught off guard and are quite interested and in some cases disgusted by the notion of more expansion in the National Hockey League after adding a couple of teams here recently. But Atlanta and Houston have been bandied about. What do you know about the NHL potentially being the first 34-team league in North America?
Here's what I know. And I'm not refuting work because I don't do that. I respect the reporting of all. The speculation around further expansion is age-old. It's just always out there, and it always seems to surface post-trade deadline because we don't have a lot to talk about. And one thing that we were reminded of by the commissioner, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting by any stretch of the imagination, other than to say that Bettman did say that expansion is not on the horizon. It's not top priority for the National Hockey League at this point. But we know the billions that are made and have been historically by expansion, right? You think of Vegas, you think of Seattle, most recent, and all that goes into that. But we also know, and we're learning through the ongoing sale process of the Ottawa Senators, guys, there is no shortage of billionaires in North America willing to step up to buy pro sports franchises. And in this case, obviously, the National Hockey League. So once the league and the process of the Ottawa Senators sale gets through, and there are groups that are left on the sidelines, what happens next? Well, they stay in constant communication with their commissioner's office to make sure that their group, the point people for these groups, are alerted to even a remote possibility of expansion. I'm sure that the number of individuals who have stepped forward, including the speculation out of Houston, out of Atlanta, that have had legit conversations with Commissioner Bettman or Deputy Commissioner Bill Daly, dozens, honestly. Like, more than a few, I can assure you of that. So it gets reported on, it gets traction in the media, but there's no appetite, according to the commissioner, to do anything on expansion at this stage.
And, of course, I think the first things first, May 16th, that Tempe Arena project on the ballot for Arizona voters. You'd have to think if they turn that down, the Coyotes might be looking for a new home. Lastly, Dregs, Blake has covered this story a fair bit, but the demise of regional sports networks and the Bally's bankruptcy about to hit here in the United States. What does that mean for NHL revenue? What does that mean for NHL playoff coverage here?
Yeah, it's not good. Yeah, I mean, let's start with the coverage. Again, Commissioner talked about that. He was asked about, the Bally Diamond situation, and he assured that the coverage will be as is for the conclusion of the regular season. They believe that it's not going to be interrupted for the start of the playoffs, and then obviously the national rights holders take over moving forward. So the league doesn't have concern with this season, but there's obvious concern about the following season. It's not like, there are that many groups, corporations out there that are willing to swoop in and just say, all right, we'll take over Bally and Diamond. You got to think that the league has had conversation with some of the big boys, right? Like Amazon, Apple, go down the list. I know that the National Hockey League has had lots of conversations about the potential, I'll use the word selling. They would probably use the word partnering to take over NHL Network, to take over NHL.com and the media entities that the league actually possesses. And the reason they would use the word partnership is because maybe you develop that into something bigger. Well, that's been out there for a while. So if you're looking at that internally, now you've got Bally Diamond in deep distress. It has to be a pretty significant concern because, look, we've got Bell and Rogers in Canada that look after the 7 Canadian teams, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And I'm sure the Canadian teams and, the two networks are reasonably pleased with those partnerships. But as I just expressed with Apple and Amazon, who's stepping up and taking over all the regional rights with some of these U.S. clubs that rely heavily on that revenue and the coverage that goes along with that? So it's a developing story, as we like to say.
Yeah, hey, Bell 55 billion, Rogers 30 billion, too big to fail on the Canadian side. Dregs, thanks for this. Enjoy the sunshine and the lobby watching there in Florida, and we'll catch up next Wednesday.
All right, guys. Thank you.